Thick clouds rolled low over the mountain ridge as I pulled my truck off the highway and onto the gravel road leading to my cabin. The scent of pine and wet earth filled the air, a familiar comfort that I hadn't felt in months. This was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Just me, the trees, and the cabin my grandfather built with his own hands. I was halfway up the incline when I saw it. A tall, sleek checkpoint gate straddling the path like a futuristic spider, all steel and sensors. At its center stood a small kiosk, unmanned but blinking red. I slowed to a stop, engine idling as my eyes scanned the signage. Private property. Access restricted by order of Pine Ridge HOA. Below it, another plaque read, Authorized dwellers and residents only. AI surveillance active. I blinked. HOA? Getting out of the truck, I approached the gate. A small camera on the kiosk whirred, focusing on my face. A synthetic voice chirped. Unregistered face detected. Please return to designated public zones. You are trespassing on managed land. I took a step back, heart already rising in my chest. What was this? I owned that cabin. Bought it outright from my uncle 10 years ago. Paid taxes on it. Hiked every inch of the land around it since I was a kid. Nobody said anything about a homeowners association. I pulled out my phone, digging through emails, property deeds, county records. Everything still listed me as the sole owner of Lot 77, including the dwelling and surrounding 2 acres. I had water rights, easement access. Everything should have been fine. But according to this gate, I didn't even have the right to approach my own front door. I tried calling the county office. Closed. Then the sheriff's department. Automated response. Finally, I tapped a number listed on the gate's base. It rang 3 times before a clipped voice answered. Pine Ridge Management Services. How may I direct your call? I own a cabin past your gate, I said. Lot 77. There was never an HOA here before. I don't know who gave you the right to block access, but... Sir, the voice interrupted. The Pine Ridge community was acquired and incorporated under Article 24 of the Urban Preservation and Automation Act. All dwellings within a 10-mile radius of the new zone fall under HOA management. If you are not compliant with the new digital registry, we cannot grant access. You can't just declare that, I shouted into the receiver. This is private land. Land use laws have evolved. Your concern has been noted. Goodbye. This you. Line went dead. I stared at the gate, seething. I wasn't about to turn around and let some automated bureaucracy keep me from what was mine. I looked at the hills rising to the east, terrain I knew by heart. If I couldn't get through the front, maybe I could go around. The old ridge path was mostly overgrown now, but it used to lead to a forgotten bridge, one my grandfather built during the Cold War. He used to joke that the Soviets would never catch him napping. I hadn't thought about that path in years. Most people didn't even know it existed. I climbed back into the truck and turned off the ignition, pulled my pack from the back seat and slung it over my shoulder. Whatever was going on, it didn't feel like some petty zoning dispute. There was money behind this, organization, and they hadn't expected resistance. They certainly didn't know the land like I did. And they definitely didn't know about the bridge. The sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged peaks as I bushwhacked through dense undergrowth, brambles clawing at my jeans and pine needles crunching underfoot. The ridge path was more eroded than I remembered. Trees had fallen across it over the years, and saplings now grew where boots once trampled. But my memory was sharp. Every switchback, every bent tree, every rise in the trail came flooding back like muscle memory. This was the path my grandfather had carved during the tail end of his life, paranoid, brilliant, and suspicious of anything with a badge or a title. He called it the Backbone Trail, but he only ever showed it to me once when I was 15. He told me that if I ever needed to get to the cabin and couldn't use the road, this was the way. I thought he was just being dramatic, the way old war vets sometimes get. But now, 15 years later, his warning felt less like paranoia and more like prophecy. After nearly an hour of climbing, I finally reached the overlook. There it was, the bridge. Rust-colored and covered in moss, it stretched about 30 yards across a deep ravine. Beneath it, a dry riverbed carved jagged rock paths between steep cliff faces. The bridge itself was built of old railway steel and timber reinforced with concrete pylons that dug deep into the rock on either side. The entrance was partially hidden by brush, and unless you knew exactly what you were looking for, you'd mistake it for part of the terrain. I stepped onto the structure cautiously, listening for the groan of old metal. Nothing. Still solid. A few boards creaked, but it held my weight. At the midpoint, I stopped and looked down into the ravine. The drop was a good 60 feet. No drone could fly this low undetected. Not with the thick canopy overhead and jamming signals my grandfather had installed long ago. He'd been a military engineer, and apparently some of those skills had found their way into his retirement hobbies. When I made it across, I paused and looked around. I was officially inside the HOA's newly secured zone, though you'd never know it. It looked just like it always had. Towering pines, chirping crickets, and the distant call of a hawk echoing through the trees. I pulled out my phone and opened the county property database app. With a few keystrokes and some patience for spotty reception, I pulled up the parcel maps. The HOA's newly drawn community boundary included dozens of properties, including mine. But as I scrolled through the overlays and annotations, something caught my eye. The bridge was marked, faintly, labeled as private infrastructure, non-HOA owned. Curious, I dug deeper. The bridge and the surrounding quarter-acre of land, including its entrance and a sliver of the path leading to it, were listed under a separate holding entity. My name. I froze. Apparently, when I inherited the cabin, I also inherited the bridge. It must have been part of an old deed package, one of those included easements that no one really thinks about. But there it was, plain as day. I owned the only physical land route into the entire valley, and more importantly, the HOA didn't. They may have locked down the main road, installed facial recognition gates and patrol drones, but they had overlooked this relic, or maybe they dismissed it as irrelevant, not realizing its strategic importance. I looked back across the ravine. That narrow span of rusted steel and timber was now the most valuable strip of land in the entire region. I could feel the shift already, not just in terms of property, but of power. I wasn't the one on the outside anymore. They were, and they had no idea I was back. By the time I reached the cabin, night had crept in. The porch light still worked, casting a warm amber glow across the wooden deck. It looked almost exactly as I left it, sturdy, weather-worn, and defiant against time. Inside, I flipped on the breakers and listened to the hum of electricity surge through the walls. The hum was familiar, grounding. I was home, but it didn't feel like peace. It felt like preparation. The next morning, I brewed coffee on the wood-burning stove and sat at the table with a pen, my tablet, and the property records I downloaded last night. The bridge was mine. There was no doubt now. Its designation as private infrastructure, non-HOA owned, gave me more than access. It gave me leverage. According to municipal code, any essential access point crossing private land required easement rights or negotiation to use. No such agreements existed between me and the newly formed HOA, meaning the only legal access route into their sealed-off neighborhood went through my bridge, and I could close it whenever I wanted. I drove some metal spikes into the ground on my side of the bridge, planted a steel post, and bolted a handmade sign to it. Private property. No trespassing without owner consent. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Then I set up a few motion-triggered cameras, analog ones, not the kind drones could hijack or spoof. I wasn't playing games. If they wanted to use my bridge, they'd need to talk to me. Properly. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, a pair of HOA representatives arrived, not through the bridge, but by air. A small black VTOL drone descended from above and landed neatly in the clearing near the cabin. It hissed open to reveal a hollow compartment carrying a projector and a sleek envelope. I unfolded the letter. It was an official notice from Pine. Ridge Management Services, stating that I was in violation of community access standards and demanding I cease obstruction of shared ingress points. I smirked. The wording was intentionally vague, but I could tell they were scrambling. I booted up the projector. A clean-cut woman in a suit appeared in a hologram, introducing herself as Kendra Lane, Director of Property Coordination. "We recognize your claim to the bridge," she said, her voice honeyed and practiced. "But we believe it is in everyone's best interest to come to a mutual agreement. Your land provides key access for emergency response, logistics, and delivery. Services vital to residents' safety." Translation: they hadn't planned for this, and now their Amazon drones and food shuttles couldn't get in. I recorded a reply on my tablet and sent it back with the drone. My message was simple. Access to the bridge is suspended until I receive legal clarification and compensation for the easement. I am not part of your HOA. Your governance doesn't extend to my land. If you believe otherwise, we can settle, eh? And in a world ruled by surveillance and control, owning something analog, something irreplaceable, made me powerful. The HOA thought they could box me out. They didn't realize I had boxed them in. The first attempt came quietly, sometime just after midnight. I was woken by a sharp electronic ping from one of the perimeter alarms I'd set up earlier in the week. Not the cameras. This was a ground sensor, the old-school kind with no wireless components, just pressure plates and hardwired signals. They couldn't be jammed, spoofed, or hacked. That was the point. I slid out of bed, grabbed the night vision, binoculars, and slipped out the back door, moving low through the underbrush. A faint whirring sound hummed through the trees, almost like a distant electric motor. I followed it to the eastern ridge above the bridge. There it was, a robotic quadruped, military style, sleek and spider-like, with a carbon fiber frame and jointed legs, was moving silently down the hill, scanning the bridge's support beams. A drone buzzed overhead, its blue sensor light blinking softly. I spotted another bot, this one smaller, on treads, trailing behind with a small crate strapped to its back. Explosives, tools, a mobile server. I backed away and activated the signal jammer I'd buried at the edge of the tree line. The effect was instant. The drone's lights flickered, and it dropped like a stone into the brush. The quadruped seized up mid-step and collapsed with a mechanical gasp. They weren't from the county. These were private contractors, the kind megacorps used for silent compliance enforcement. Not officially armed, but built for intimidation. Maybe they thought I'd be asleep or too far from the bridge to notice. Maybe they thought I was just some stubborn backwoods loner clinging to an old shack. They didn't know what kind of war my grandfather had prepared me for. By morning, I had all 3 devices disassembled in the cabin workshop. They weren't just surveillance machines, they were nodes. Part of a mesh network trying to map terrain, scan infrastructure, and possibly sabotage the bridge itself. One of them contained an encrypted hard drive. That was interesting. I reached out to an old contact, Mina, a former coder from a now-defunct digital rights collective. She owed me a favor. Within a few hours, she sent me a decryption patch disguised as an old firmware update. It bypassed the security system like a ghost. The files were disturbing. Blueprints of the valley, neural mapping overlays, behavioral, data points from HOA residents, walking patterns, eye movement frequency, interaction rates with surveillance bots. One document was labeled Test Region 17A, Behavioral Loop Stability Metrics. This wasn't about neighborhood security. It was a live experiment. The HOA wasn't just enforcing order. They were part of a larger program, likely under contract with a megacorp, testing long-term AI-guided behavioral conditioning. That's why they sealed the valley, restricted access, and locked everyone inside under the guise of community optimization. The drones weren't just watching. They were rewriting behavior through controlled repetition, nudges, and carefully designed frustrations. And my cabin, my bridge, was the uncontrolled variable, a breach in their perfect system. I sat in silence for a while, staring at the forest swaying through the kitchen window. This wasn't just a land dispute anymore. They weren't trying to kick me out. They were trying to erase what I represented: autonomy, unpredictability, and analog resistance. I uploaded the files to 3 encrypted dead drops and began preparing a broadcast. They thought they could run a quiet experiment behind locked gates. But experiments are fragile things. All it takes is a single anomaly to bring the whole simulation crashing down. And I had just become the anomaly. I launched the broadcast at dawn. No intro, no theatrics, just the raw truth. I stitched together clips from the drone footage, decrypted documents, and intercepted messages. Then I narrated over them, calmly, precisely, laying out the facts. The HOA wasn't a benign organization, but a front for a behavioral modification experiment funded by Helix Corp, one of the largest tech conglomerates in the world. I showed the blueprints, the predictive models, the neural overlays. The broadcast hit decentralized networks first: off-grid message boards, meshnet forums, whistleblower hubs. By noon, it was viral. Citizen journalists picked it up. Independent analysts verified the metadata, and people began asking questions. Within a day, larger outlets started sniffing around. By the end of the week, it was on mainstream feeds. The term Pine Ridge experiment trended across social platforms. The HOA board scrambled to release a statement, calling the evidence fabricated and taken out of context. But that only made it worse. They couldn't explain the encrypted drone, or why a civilian's private bridge had been targeted by corporate tech operatives in the middle of the night. The pressure mounted fast. Residents inside the HOA zone began to revolt. Some had suspected things were off for months: strange lapses in memory, changes in their routines, a creeping sameness to their daily lives. Now they had proof. A few even found the neural feedback implants in their smartwatches and home assistant devices, tiny tech installed during the Smart Living Upgrade program, supposedly to improve mental wellness. Helix Corp went into damage control, claiming Pine Ridge was an isolated project and that no behavioral manipulation was conducted without resident consent. But internal memos leaked, share prices fell, a federal investigation launched, and the bridge became a symbol. Journalists filmed me standing on it, framed by the forest and the old cabin behind me, defiant in a digital world that had forgotten how to value resistance. Activists started calling it the last gate. Artists made renders. Hacktivists traced other quiet zones across the country, and soon it wasn't just about Pine Ridge. It was about autonomy, consent, and who really controlled the infrastructure we live under. I didn't ask for it, but they made me the face of it. Eventually, officials came. Not HOA suits or corp enforcers, but federal investigators, escorted by legal observers and neutral AI arbitration units. They reviewed the property records, questioned me, and examined the drones. I handed over everything. I had nothing to hide. 3 weeks later, a federal judge ruled that the HOA had no legal authority to restrict access to my property or any route tied to my infrastructure. The HOA was dissolved, its leadership fined. Pine Ridge was stripped of its corporate zoning status and declared a neutral residential zone. Most of the surveillance tech was dismantled. They offered to buy the bridge from me, first gently, then aggressively, then with veiled threats. I declined every time. I rebuilt the railing. Painted a sign, private, public, in bold white letters. A paradox, maybe, but one that made people think. Now the cabin's more than just mine. Journalists come by, students, activists. They cross the bridge and sit on the porch and ask me what it was like to hold the line. I tell them the truth. I wasn't trying to start a movement. I was just trying to go home. But sometimes, defending something simple, your land, your rights, your place in the world, can unravel the most sophisticated lies, not with weapons, not with violence, just with ownership and the will to say no.